What most people don't realize is that while Washington was busy tweeting about trade wars, Japan quietly made the most consequential economic decision in North American history. They didn't announce it with fanfare. They didn't hold press conferences. They simply started shipping through Canadian ports instead of American ones. And that single shift is rewriting the entire architecture of Pacific trade. I've been watching American foreign policy for decades, and I can tell you that the most dangerous moments aren't when enemies attack. They're when allies quietly decide you're no longer dependable. And that's exactly what happened when Japanese corporations began systematically rerouting their North American supply chains away from the United States and toward Canada. This wasn't retaliation. This wasn't punishment. This was risk management. And it should terrify anyone who understands how global economics actually works. The public story, as most Americans heard it, was simple enough. Tariffs were imposed, trade tensions escalated, markets adjusted. But what the headlines missed was the quiet revolution happening in corporate boardrooms across Japan. While American politicians were staging theatrical confrontations about trade deficits and industrial policy, Japanese executives were doing something far more consequential. They were rewriting their fundamental assumptions about American reliability. For 70 years, Japan has been America's most important Pacific ally, not just militarily, but economically. Japanese companies built their North American strategies around one core assumption: that the United States would remain a stable, predictable partner. Supply chains were designed around American ports, distribution networks flowed through American logistics hubs, investment decisions assumed American policy continuity. This wasn't sentimentality, it was mathematics. When you're moving billions of dollars worth of goods across an ocean, you need to know the rules won't change overnight. But rules did change overnight. And when they did, Japanese corporations discovered something that should have been obvious, but apparently wasn't to policymakers in Washington. In global capitalism, loyalty is a luxury that shareholders don't pay for. When political instability makes American routes more expensive and less reliable than Canadian alternatives, capital doesn't hesitate. It moves. The shift began with automotive manufacturing, which makes perfect sense if you understand how integrated these supply chains really are. A single car contains thousands of components that might cross the Pacific multiple times before reaching a showroom. When tariffs started spiking unpredictably and trade policy became a daily political drama, Japanese automakers faced a choice. They could absorb higher costs and accept greater uncertainty, or they could redesign their North American operations around Canadian infrastructure. Toyota made the calculation first. Instead of shipping directly to Long Beach or Los Angeles, they began routing more cargo through Vancouver. The math was straightforward. Canadian trade policy was boring. Tariffs were stable. Regulations were predictable. Port operations weren't subject to political whiplash. For a company that plans investments in decades, not election cycles, boring is beautiful. Honda followed quickly, then Nissan, then the suppliers. What started as individual corporate decisions began creating momentum. When logistics networks shift, they don't shift alone. Warehousing follows, distribution follows, even financial services follow. Before long, you have what economists call agglomeration effects. Canada wasn't just offering an alternative route, it was offering an alternative ecosystem. But here's what makes this story particularly revealing about American power in decline. The Japanese government never announced a pivot away from the United States. Japanese executives never held press conferences declaring their loss of confidence in American leadership. They didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. When Canadian ports started handling cargo that used to flow through American facilities, when Japanese investment in Canadian infrastructure began outpacing investment in American alternatives, when supply chains quietly rerouted themselves away from political volatility, the message was clear. Actions, as they say, speak louder than words. I want you to understand what this means in practical terms because the implications extend far beyond shipping manifests and port statistics. When Japan treats Canada as a more reliable partner than the United States, it's not making a judgment about geography or economics. It's making a judgment about governance. It's saying that Canadian political institutions can be trusted to maintain consistent policies over time, while American institutions cannot. That judgment matters because it shapes every subsequent decision. If you're a Japanese company considering where to build your next North American factory, do you choose a location that depends on American supply chains or Canadian ones? If you're negotiating a 20-year supply contract, do you structure it around American ports or Canadian alternatives? If you're planning the next generation of Pacific trade relationships, do you anchor them in Seattle or Vancouver? These aren't hypothetical questions anymore. They're decisions being made right now in corporate headquarters across Asia, and increasingly, the answers favor Canada, not because Canada somehow became a better geographic position or a larger market, but because Canada maintained something that America abandoned: predictability. The Port of Vancouver illustrates this perfectly. 5 years ago, it was handling a respectable but unremarkable volume of Asian trade. Today, it's experiencing unprecedented growth, largely because companies that used to rely on American ports are seeking alternatives. Canadian officials didn't steal this business. They simply offered what American ports could no longer guarantee: the confidence that tomorrow's rules would resemble today's rules. This is where the human cost of institutional breakdown becomes visible. American longshoremen who built careers around Pacific trade are watching cargo volumes decline. Communities that grew up around port activity are seeing investment flow elsewhere. The economic multiplier effects of a major port extend far beyond the waterfront. When ships stop coming, truck drivers lose routes, warehouses sit empty, service businesses lose customers. The ripple effects reach deep into regional economies, and none of this was necessary. Japan didn't want to reduce its economic ties with the United States. These companies had invested decades building relationships with American suppliers, distributors, and customers. Changing established supply chains is expensive and disruptive, but when policy volatility makes those relationships untenable, pragmatism overrides sentiment. Capital goes where it can operate with confidence. What's particularly striking about this shift is how it accelerated other changes that were already underway. When Japan began treating Canada as a primary entry point to North America, it didn't just affect Japanese companies. It sent a signal to other Asian economies that alternatives to American infrastructure were viable and increasingly attractive. South Korean companies began exploring similar arrangements. Chinese firms already dealing with American trade restrictions found Canadian routes offered not just geographic alternatives, but political ones. The result is that Canada has quietly emerged as Asia's preferred gateway to North America, not through any grand strategy or aggressive competition, but simply by maintaining institutional competence while America indulged in institutional chaos. This is how power shifts in the modern world, not through military conquest or dramatic confrontation, but through patient capital allocation decisions made by executives who care more about quarterly earnings than geopolitical drama. For American policymakers, this should be a sobering lesson in how quickly strategic advantages can evaporate when institutions become unreliable. The United States didn't lose its geographic advantages. It didn't suddenly lack the capacity to handle Pacific trade. It lost something more fundamental: the trust of its most important allies. And trust, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. The tragedy here is that this was entirely avoidable. Japan wanted to maintain its traditional American partnerships. Canadian officials would have preferred continued cooperation rather than competitive advantage. But when faced with a choice between absorbing American political volatility and seeking Canadian stability, the market made a rational decision. Stability won. As I watch this transformation unfold, I'm reminded of how great powers typically decline. Not through dramatic defeats, but through the slow erosion of influence as allies and partners quietly conclude that reliability has become too expensive to maintain. When the most loyal allies start planning around you instead of with you, it's usually a sign that institutional credibility has been damaged in ways that can't be repaired with speeches or threats. The Japanese pivot to Canada represents something more consequential than a trade dispute or a policy disagreement. It represents the moment when America's most important Pacific ally decided that American institutions could no longer be trusted to provide the stability that global commerce requires. That decision, made quietly in boardrooms rather than announced in press conferences, may prove to be one of the most significant geopolitical shifts of our time. And the most troubling aspect of this entire episode is how avoidable it was. All it required was the kind of institutional restraint and policy predictability that America once provided as a matter of course. Instead, we chose chaos. And chaos, as the Japanese have quietly demonstrated, is simply too expensive for serious countries to afford.